Throughout the process of learning how to mix music, many people hit a wall where they know something's wrong, but they can't quite name it. Whether the kick is fighting the bass or the vocal is just sitting on top of everything instead of being inside the mix as a cohesive piece. Whatever it is, you end up turning the same knobs back and forth for about an hour, and somehow you end up worse than where you started. If you've done that, leave a comment below. I definitely have done that, and I'm sure we're not alone. It's not that you're doing something wrong. What's missing is the connection between what you're hearing and what you can actually do about it using the tools available. That connection is what a good education gives you. But it's harder to find good education than it should be. A lot of mixing videos on YouTube, my own included, tend to teach you how tools work, which is helpful information, but it's less common to find videos that tell you how to translate what you're hearing into adjustments on those tools. Today, I want to walk you through 4 concepts, one for each of the primary tools you're probably already using: EQ, compression, reverb, and delay. Each one is a specific idea that gave me a framework for when to choose the tool and what to listen for once the tool is in the signal chain. These come from the Mixing and Ear Training program at Audio University, which is taught by myself and Gabe Herman, who's been teaching audio engineering and mixing professionally for over 20 years. I'm going to pull some clips from the course so you can hear Gabe explain these ideas directly. And if any of this lands for you, the program is linked in the show notes below. Let's start with EQ, because I think it's where most people spend most of their time, and it's also where most people are working much harder than they really need to. The typical approach goes something like this. You hear something off in the mix, you open an EQ plugin, you sweep a boost around until you find a frequency that sounds bad, and then you cut it. And the logic here makes sense. And it is really a good tool and a good technique that I still use at times. The problem is that it can lead to more problems than it solves. If you apply a big boost while you sweep through the frequency spectrum, you can make almost anything sound terrible at almost any frequency, which means you end up cutting things that weren't actually problems in the first place. There's a faster way to get your bearings with EQ that one of my teachers taught me. Certain frequencies correspond to vowel sounds. Your mouth is a resonant cavity, and when you shape it to say a vowel sound, you're resonating at a specific frequency. Once you make that connection between what frequency corresponds to what vowel sound, you have a reference point every time you open an EQ. Around 250 hertz, you get the oo sound, like the word boot. Move up to 500 hertz, and it shifts to an O sound, like boat. At 1 kilohertz, you're in ah territory, like the word father. 2 kilohertz is more like A, as in face. And 4 kilohertz is an E sound, like the word meat. Above 4 kilohertz, you start to get into the sibilance range. 8 kilohertz gives you a clean S sound. Higher than that, it gets sharper, almost like an S mixed with a T at 16 kilohertz. Below 250 hertz, you can focus on the physical sensation of the sound in the body. 125 hertz, you tend to feel in your chest, and 63 hertz, you feel lower, especially when you're listening through full-range speakers or a system with subwoofers. What this gives you is a way to connect what you're hearing to where you need to go on an EQ. A vocal that sounds boxy might have too much energy around 500 hertz or 1 kilohertz, somewhere between O and Ah. A mix that sounds harsh usually is a buildup of energy sitting between 2 kilohertz and 4 kilohertz, between A and E. I'd encourage you to download the free ear training guide linked below this video for a quick reference for each of these reference points I've just shared with you. You can also download it at audiouniversityonline.com/ear-training-guide. This was a huge revelation for me when I learned it. And even if many engineers don't use this exact method, they probably have some tricks of their own, reference points for what they're hearing. Here's Gabe describing how he approaches an electric guitar in one of the mix sessions within our course.
This guitar really speaks from kind of the back of the mouth. It's got like an ah kind of vibe to it. And I use my mouth and I use the sounds in my mouth to EQ all the time because it helps to kind of place things in my body and then I can internalize them better.
That instinct, translating what you hear into something your body already knows and understands, is a foundational element of ear training that actually sticks with you. The key is repetition. You hear it, identify it, apply a change, and check the result. And over time, you stop guessing and start using EQ with a goal in mind. Okay, compression. Most people learn to think of a compressor as a dynamics tool. It catches loud moments and pulls them back. And that's accurate, but it misses something else that's important about what compressors actually do to the sound. And after watching Gabe teach this, it really started to click for me. Here's how Gabe puts it in the course.
Compressors make square waves. They are really not generating the effect that most people associate with dynamic range control. While they do control dynamics, it's the interaction of their dynamic range control devices and components that generate harmonic saturation and harmonic distortion in a way that is different than just dynamic range control. And so we need to be able to think about dynamic range control separate from harmonic distortion. And you might get further learning how to use a compressor, not just by hearing how the dynamics of the signal change under compression, but at the same time learning to hear what the harmonic qualities are of too much compression or poorly timed compression, etc. You should focus on the intent. Why do we use a compressor? What changes do we want to see in our sound? What should stay the same? Think of compressors as distortion boxes and pair them with complementary source material. So if you have a very fast transient in a snare drum signal, say you've recorded your snare with an API 512 mic pre with an op amp circuit, those do a great job of preserving transients. It may be advantageous for you to then use a compressor paired with that signal that's able to handle very fast transients. So think about the tool as being the way that tool is designed to be applied to a specific type of sound, and that might help you develop a better strategy. And we will discuss strategies as another part in the series. Lastly, I want you to remember, and this is the most important thing, and you may get tired of me hammering on them so hard throughout this, but compressors are not intelligent. You are intelligent.
Compressors as distortion devices, not just as dynamic controllers. Every time a compressor acts on a signal, it's not just turning down the loud parts, it's changing the shape of the waveform. And that change produces harmonic distortion. The character of that distortion comes directly from your attack and release settings. A fast attack means the compressor clamps down quickly and starts reshaping the waveform almost immediately. And a fast release means it recovers very quickly. The more aggressively the waveform gets reshaped, the more harmonic distortion is produced, and the more the character of the sound changes. Slower settings mean less reshaping, less distortion, and a cleaner sound overall. That's a big part of why two compressors with different time constants can sound completely different at the same ratio and threshold. The timing settings aren't just controlling dynamics, they're also controlling character. Here's Gabe working on a kick drum, using compression specifically to shape the tone.
I want to talk about setting attack and release times and how I might use a compressor to shape the tone of a kick drum. In this session, I've got just one track we're going to be listening to, which is the kick in mic. Let's give it a listen. In our previous session on EQ, I discussed how I used this frequency curve to enhance the sound of the kick drum. I'm going to bypass that so we can hear the difference of the signal without the EQ versus with the EQ. Without it. With it. What I'd like to point out is that we used an EQ in our previous session to enhance the low frequency content and to make the articulation of the kick drum a little stronger while reducing some of the frequencies that were shadowing the upper mid-range closer to around 200 hertz. We call this the mud range. Today, when we install a compressor behind this signal, we're going to be changing the envelope and introducing harmonic distortion to that signal. When I think about what I want to change about this signal, I have to be very careful. If I were looking at the frequency response as drawn on the waveforms of our edit window, you'll see very fast transients followed by some pretty quiet resonances. Of course, this is what the waveform looks like before the EQ, not after. If I wanted to do that, if I wanted to see what it looks like, I would have to commit the audio up to this level, which I'm going to do right now. As I do this, what I'm going to see is a change in the waveform that will actually represent what's different now that I have made the EQ rendered. What we see now is that before, the body of the kick drum, which was a little bit weak, has been made a little bit stronger. But we still have these very strong transients, followed by some relatively quiet resonance of the kick drum. What I'd like to do is use a compressor to tame the transients and make these sections here after the transient a little bit louder. If I use my cursor tool to select just this amount of time that is my transient for this kick drum hit, I can look up and see that it's about 1 millisecond of time here from start to end, a difference of 0.096 milliseconds, or a tenth of a millisecond, I should say. So when I set up my compressor, what I want to be very careful of is that I'm not making the time too long. If I make the attack time too long, I'll end up setting up a compressor that's too slow to be able to react to the signal. And that means I'll end up compressing what's happening on the back end of my signal, this later part, which is the body and the resonance and the decay of the tone of the envelope of the signal. That wouldn't be good at all, because what I really want to do is squash the transient, not the body. So I need to keep my attack times pretty quick. Lucky for me, this stock compressor that comes with Pro Tools is very quick. I'm going to set the attack time to 10 picoseconds. That's way fast enough to be able to get out in front of this transient. At the same time, I want to make sure that my release time is also very fast, because I want the compressor to be able to stop compressing relatively quick. I need to reduce the volume here. If I go with something strong like 6-to-1 compression, that's going to create many more harmonic odd order harmonic elements in my signal than I think I really want. I like the way this sounds right now. It's warm, it's punchy, it's thick. If I start introducing too many odd order harmonics to the signal, it's going to change the timbre of the signal to be more crunchy, more gritty, maybe a little bit more aggressive, which is fine for some music, not in this case. So I'm going to set my attack time to be very fast, my release time to be very, very fast. I'm going to set my ratio to something a little bit more prudent, say 2-to-1. I'm going to be very judicious with my threshold. I want to make sure that the signal is just barely coming up over the threshold. Remember, the further down I bring the threshold, the more of the signal will be squared off. So I really don't want to be too aggressive with this, or else I might end up having it sound a little bit crunchy. Just to demonstrate what that sounds like, though, I am going to show you what it sounds like when we go a little too far. But let's start with just trying to find a good starting point. So I'm going to bypass this compressor. I'm going to select a little bit of signal here, and we're going to loop it. Now we have our kick drum soloed. I'm looking at the meter, and I'm seeing that the threshold, the way it's set right now, the needle just basically pops right over the edge of this threshold line just when the transients hit. I can also see that it rebounds back pretty fast. I'm going to up my threshold just a little bit more. And I'm going to slowly bring it down up and until I start to see some orange flashes that come all the way down to close to about -3. More than that, and I'm going to start to really be introducing a lot of harmonic distortion. The other thing I need to be careful of is that there are some hits that are a little bit stronger than others. There's no consistency here. So maybe my goal is to make all the transients consistent and then work from there. So I'll bring down my threshold. To where all of my transients are basically getting hit a little bit. This will make sure that all of these tops are getting brought down. Now, I'm going to put in, take the bypass out, and we'll hear what that sounds like. Instantly, we can hear that squaring off of that waveform, that harmonic distortion. Too much. I'm going to give back a little bit. That's a little better, but I can still hear some crackle. Now I'll start to slow down the release time a little bit. Now I should be able to back my threshold in a little bit more without hearing as much of that distortion, because my compressor isn't acting as strong. It's not creating as sharp a square wave. That sounds better. Now if I bypass it, and with the compressor in, it's quieter. The transients aren't as loud. And if we listen very carefully, we might actually even be able to start to hear some of those harmonics creeping into the tone of the signal. I'm going to make this a little bit louder though. I'm going to use my makeup gain now to make the overall signal louder. That should help to bring out these resonance that I'm trying to bring out in my tone. But as I do, you'll also start to hear the harmonic distortion come out from the compressor. Without the compression, with it. In my description earlier, in my presentation, I discussed that we should think about compressors as time-based processors. What I think we can hear happening here is that we've gone from hearing a sound that is very short in its time, the transients, to hearing a sound that's actually quite long in its resonance. It takes a lot longer for the sound to go away. It's because I'm compressing the signal and I'm compressing the transients and I'm bringing up all the noise floor stuff that's happening later. So what's happening is, you could think of it as controlling dynamic range, but what I'm really doing is making the sound last longer, which is a time domain process, right? I'm making the sound last longer. Therefore, we're going to hear it a little bit clearer. It's going to sound louder to our ear. The other thing is I've introduced a lot of harmonic distortion. And we can hear that the kick drum has gone from being kind of low and punchy and ticky to being kind of frum, loose and flappy. And these are bad descriptive words, but they're the best we can do when we're talking about subjective, qualitative assessment here. I can measure their harmonics, but I can describe it as being different in some sort of way. That's not just the harmonics, but the quality of the sound. So we have to figure out a way to balance the issues here. We have, on the one hand, I'm succeeding at compressing and suppressing the transient of the signal. On the other hand, as I'm doing that, I'm also bringing up the harmonics in the back end of the signal, and that's not very good. So we have to find a way to kind of come to terms here. So I'm going to introduce a compromise. Perhaps what I want here is not as much compression. Maybe I can take 1.5 to 1 instead of 2 to 1. That should help. I can also soften my knee. By softening the knee, I'm making it so that I'm not squaring off the compressor. The compressor's not squaring off the waveform quite as aggressively. It's going to curve around that compression point, which should help to preserve some of those transients that had that sine wave type element to them, so that they're not suddenly becoming flat mesas. That should also help. So let's try introducing some knee, and we've backed off the ratio a little bit. That's much better. Without the compression. With it. Here we're hearing a little bit less of an aggressive harmonic tonality to the compression.
If compression adds harmonic distortion every time it acts on a signal, then using it to fix uneven dynamics means adding coloration to every moment you're trying to correct. The compressor doesn't know it's dealing with a word that got swallowed or a guitar phrase that was played softer. It reacts to level, and it reacts the same way every single time. You're smarter than a compressor, though. For the dynamic problems that are really about performance, a phrase that's too quiet or a syllable that got lost, you might be better off going in manually. That could mean adjusting the clip or region gain, which happens before the signal hits the compressor. That way, you smooth out the performance before the compressor even sees the signal. Then the compressor can focus on what it's actually there for, adding texture and character if you want texture and character. Here's how Gabe explains it.
You should try to get 90% of the way there with your tracking technique, your clip gain automation, or with volume automation, and then use the last 10% of that control. Maybe that's done with a compressor. Okay, and this is the number one trick that once I show my students how this works, like suddenly compression just becomes a lot more intuitive. It's funny. There's things about dynamic range that have to do with performance and not harmonic distortion. So if you want to control the dynamics of a signal, you shouldn't reach for a compressor to do that. Reach for, if you're in the tracking stage, repositioning the microphone. Maybe it's pulling the microphone further away so that you don't have quite as much of a dynamic range between loud bits and smaller bits because everything's less focused. That can still sound really great. And in fact, pulling the mic back might help you be more successful at using compression while tracking, because the compressor isn't trying to do the heavy lifting of pulling the levels down when it goes significantly above the threshold. But most of that's just been taken care of naturally by the inverse square law and the fact that you're pulling the microphone away. You're pulling the mic away so you get less proximity effect in the vocal. The dynamic range of the vocal will get naturally more even. And then when the compressor is activated, it's working on a much smaller percentage of the signal than if it's right up in the mouth of the performer, where it's having to do an awful lot. You're just going to get a lot of harmonic distortion from that, not necessarily the dynamic range control that you might want in the presentation of a performance. So my suggestion is to try to get the dynamic range part of your signal under control using automation, and be intelligent about which syllables you want to emphasize. Put a little flourish on the last line of every vocal. Think about words like and the and from and the small syllables that sometimes get lost. Try to boost those up with gain control, gain automation, so that they're more present. Because a compressor isn't going to be listening to the lyrics and deciding, I didn't understand what they said right there. I should have compressed that better. Compressors are not smart. They do not take intelligence into consideration when they make their changes. They act aggressively and consistently, and they will not bring humanity into your tracks.
The goal isn't to avoid compressors. It's to use them for what they do well and stop asking them to solve problems they can't fully understand. You're probably already familiar with the standard use of reverb in a mix. You put something in a space to make it feel more real, or you add a shared room to a mix so everything feels like it belongs together. Both of those are useful, but when I watched Gabe explain another situation where he uses reverb, it took me by surprise. He thinks of reverb in some cases as an EQ tool. not just a metaphor for EQ, but as an actual way to control the tonal balance of the full sound. When a room resonates, it reinforces certain frequencies and lets others decay faster. So by choosing the type of reverb, shaping its frequency content, and controlling its decay time, you can augment the tonal character of the instrument in a way that feels more tonal than spatial. Here's Gabe working on an acoustic guitar that's been EQ'd and compressed, and is sitting reasonably well in the mix, but still feeling a bit pointed and edgy. He goes to reverb in this case.
People would think of reverb as being spatial, but I'm actually going to use this to create timbre, make the body of the guitar feel a little bit more mellow. As I'm listening to this, it just feels like the guitar is very kind of pointy and edgy. So what I've done here is I've created an aux return and a send that's called AGT verb, and I'm going to send this acoustic guitar to this return, and on this return I'm going to insert a reverb. And I don't want anything too special. It doesn't have to be something fantastical. In this case I'm using D-verb. I'm going to turn the gain reduction all the way off so that it's not pulling anything out of there. And I'm going to set the room parameter to small. And I really don't want much here, maybe about 178 milliseconds. That's all I really need to do. And then I want to pull the high frequencies down to maybe, I don't know, 1.6K. So I'm going to put the fader up here. Let's hear what this sounds like. I'm just going to solo the acoustic guitar, and we'll see what this reverb sounds like. If I mute the reverb, that's pretty cool. It gives it a room, it gives it a space, it definitely makes it feel more stereo. And I'm starting to get into the direction of it sounding warmer, but I haven't really gotten there. So I'm going to go into like my EQ here after this reverb, and I'm just going to make a bump at around 200 hertz. What I'm also going to do, so that it doesn't get in the way of the bass, is I'm going to pre-delay this signal maybe about 10 milliseconds or so. And I'll stop at 12. That seems feasible. And I'm probably going to want to de-accentuate the high frequencies as much as I can. So I might just throw in a nice gentle shelf here to further that along. So I'm really tilting the tonality of this. And this hopefully makes the room reflect the low harmonics that are bouncing around inside the reverb program. That's going to make the guitar feel thicker without adding low frequencies via EQ into the sound directly. And I feel a little space between where the reverb starts and where the guitar ends. So you can hear how the guitar is starting to take on that darker tone. Now I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to compress the reverb. What we're going to try to achieve is take all of the fast-acting stuff that's in there and kind of pull it out and let it release really slow. We're going to set the ratio of compression to maybe 5:6 to 1 and a really soft knee like this. And I'm just going to pull back the threshold so we're burying the reverb kind of in constant compression. Then I'm going to use the output gain to bring it back up in my mix. And you'll feel that instantly my guitar sounds and feels warmer, like a warmer bodied instrument. If I took this out, not only do we lose the space, but you can sense that the low harmonics just kind of disappear out of it.
The guitar gets warmer and thicker without any change to the dry signal itself. He's not EQing the guitar, he's EQing the room and what it gives back. The same principle applies across different instruments. Here's Gabe again on a snare drum, deciding he wants the snare to sound thicker and fuller.
Okay, now just the short reverb. You can almost hear how it's giving a sort of a flammy feel to it. And again, this is just the dry snare by itself. Now with our processing. So hopefully you can hear that there's a change not just in the presentation of the stereo image or the space around the snare, but also a timbral shift in the snare. I could have made the snare feel thicker with EQ, but the room can do a lot of that work for me as well. And rather than try to make that individual track thicker or try to push more low frequencies into, say, a compressor, which might react negatively to it, instead I'll just do some parallel processing in the reverb and try to get the reverb to add harmonics to my dry signal and hopefully make the snare sound more full and lush.
Different instrument, same idea. Once you start thinking about the reverb return as something you can shape tonally, the way you use reverb will change. The central idea Gabe comes back to throughout the delay section of the course is that time and space are the same thing. Delay is how we perceive distance. When a sound arrives at your left ear slightly before it arrives at your right ear, your brain doesn't hear two different sounds, it hears one sound coming from the left side. That tiny timing difference is how you locate things in the world around you, and you've been doing it your whole life, whether you thought about it that way or not. Think about how you judge distance with your eyes. Close one eye and you lose depth perception. The brain needs two slightly different views of the same thing to build a 3D picture, and hearing works in a similar way. Delay is one of the most important tools we have for creating dimension and depth. What makes this practical is understanding that different amounts of delay do completely different things. Gabe organizes them into 3 time windows. The first is the binaural window, from roughly 1 to 10 milliseconds. In this range, your brain doesn't separate 2 instances of the same sound into 2 distinct events. It sums them together and reads the timing as a localization cue. A few milliseconds of delay on the right side, for example, makes the whole thing feel like it's coming from the left, with no panning required. Some engineers use this concept called the Haas effect to push things wider than the physical speaker boundaries. The catch is monocompatibility, though. When you sum a binaural delay to mono, the 2 versions of the signal interfere with each other, and what might have sounded huge in stereo sounds phasey and mono. So it's always worth checking your mix in mono before committing. The second window is early reflections, from about 15 to 35 milliseconds. This is where delay stops being a positioning tool and starts being an acoustic tool. At 15 milliseconds, the brain has just enough processing time to register the delayed signal as something separate from the original. And done intentionally, it can register to the listener as a reflection off of a nearby wall. A helpful guideline is that 1 foot of distance equals roughly 1 millisecond of delay. So 15 milliseconds implies a 15-foot path. That means delay can be used to define the size of the space you're trying to create within your mix. You push it higher in this range, and the implied space gets larger. This is how you make a dry recording feel like it was captured somewhere. And the concept can also be implemented using the pre-delay setting that you might find in a reverb plugin. The third window is late reflections, from 35 to 60 milliseconds. This range adds a deeper sense of room, less about where you are and more about the character of the space itself. The back wall, the texture of the surfaces. Monocompatibility is less of a problem here because the signals have enough time between them that they're not fighting each other as much. And the level between the direct and indirect delays tends to be wider, and that also results in less interference. Beyond 60 seconds, the brain stops reading the second sound as connected to the first. It becomes its own event. That's the territory of rhythmic echoes and slapback, creative effects, rather than acoustic simulation. When you understand how the brain interprets different delay times, you get a sense for what's possible with delay. And the next time you want to add dimensionality or special effects to a mix, you can get close to the settings you need without digging through presets. So those are the 4. EQ through the lens of vowel sounds, so you have a reference every time you open an EQ. Compression as something that shapes the tone of a signal just as much as the dynamics, with clip gain handling the outliers in the performance before the signal reaches the compressor. Reverb as a tonal tool, not just a spatial tool. And delay as a set of time zones, each one producing a different effect on how the listener experiences the space around the sound. There's a point Gabe makes at the end of the course that I don't think enough of us focus on while we're mixing. It's one skill to use compression and EQ to make individual instruments sound good. It's a different skill entirely to use those same tools to make instruments work together. So everything has its own space, and so that the whole thing feels like one cohesive sound. That second skill is what the course is actually building toward. Information about mixing, or anything for that matter, isn't hard to come by anymore. And that's exciting. But the challenge is still to build a skill that will actually stick with you. And that takes structured practice, feedback on your work, and time spent in the material with other people working through the same things. The Audio University membership is built around that exactly. The courses are taught by myself, Gabe Herman, and other guest instructors with decades of experience mixing and teaching. Beyond the courses, both Gabe and I are active in the membership. You can leave comments directly on the lessons or ask questions when something doesn't click. And you can get a response from one of us or from both of us, and we'll each share our perspective. We also run live coaching events periodically, where you can ask questions face-to-face, and there's also a mix review feature, where you can submit a mix and get expert feedback from Gabe himself. A lot of people in the membership are working through the same problems, and hearing responses to other people's questions tends to move you forward in ways that watching videos won't do on its own. You still have to put the practice in yourself, though, to actually hear results. But having that support structure around you changes how fast that happens. The membership includes the ear training lab and downloadable multitracks so you can put the theory into practice. If you're looking for more than just videos to watch and you're willing to put in the work, the link is in the show notes below. I'll see you in the next video.